Welcome to the Education 760 class, and today we're going to talk about week 1 in class on program evaluation and strategic planning. I'd like you to think about what it is that you'd really like to learn about program evaluation and strategic planning. We discussed this in class, and many of you bring experiences from your practitioner world to program evaluation and strategic planning. And so based on those experiences, there are some things that we do know about program evaluation and strategic planning, and also some things that we don't know and what we want to know. So as we give ourselves an introduction to these two topics this evening, I want you to continually draw upon your own experiences with these two topics. Here are our course goals and our course objectives. And the course goals on your left-hand side of the screen are more broadly defined, whereas the course objectives are objectives that are more specifically defined of the Education 760 class. So really what we want to do tonight is to define the purpose of program evaluations and what is the definition of program evaluation and how does that differ with our own experiences of program evaluation. With this particular model, we focus on Patton's framework for program evaluation called utilization-focused evaluation. So how is that different, again, than the program evaluations we do traditionally in our school districts? Which gets into number 2. There are differences between various program evaluation methods and models, and when is it appropriate to employ each of those methods. You will have an opportunity with this class to develop and conduct your own utilization-focused program evaluation. And number 4, hopefully we have some opportunity to look at exemplars of other program evaluations that have been done and evaluate those against the UFE framework. And then bullets 5 and 6 really get at the strategic planning, where you'll have an opportunity to look at your own school district or workplace strategic plan, and you'll compare and contrast that to UWE's model for strategic plan. And finally, you'll develop a model for strategic planning that is in the best interest of your educational organization. Here are our norms that we discussed that everybody agreed upon in class last night, so we'll continually refer ourselves to the norms at the beginning of every class, just as a friendly reminder. Here are the course expectations that are defined on pages 4 and 5 of your syllabus. So really pointed out the importance of reviewing pages 4 and 5 of the syllabus, which includes the assessment procedure for all assignments, which I take into consideration when I'm grading your assignments that you have followed these directions. I'd like to note the correction on the syllabus on page 4. That is a mistake with your program evaluation assignment. That's your big assignment that's worth 300 points, and that is due at the beginning of class 6, not class number 8 as indicated in the syllabus. This is just kind of a graphic organizer that breaks down what we'll be learning each week in Education 760. And you can see that on week 2, week 4, and week 6 and week 8 are the days or the weeks where assignments are due. And so we'll be discussing this in more detail. You can see that on week 2, at the beginning of week 2 class for next week, you have a journal article that's due where you'll be reviewing the journal article. It's written by Margaret Ross, and you can get this article under the week 2 Google folder and follow the directions there where your article review needs to be no longer than 2 pages, the actual review itself, but your article needs to include a cover page, the 2-page review, and then a references page. And I think I sent everybody an email on that. And so we'll be looking at APA style So make sure that when you write your review of your article, you proofread it. For any inaccuracies, might want to have someone else take a look at it because that is considered in the assessment part of the process with your article. We'll be referring to this graphic organizer every week, so you might want to print a copy and always have it by your side as we review the assignments and the readings for each week at the beginning of class and also at the end of class. So this is what we'll be learning tonight. And you can see there are, 7 different bullets. So mainly we'll be concentrating on steps 1 through 4 of the UFE framework. So to get our mind set with program evaluation, we looked at this yesterday in class. What words and feelings do you associate with the word evaluation? And it was pretty much unanimous with everyone saying that most of us associate a negative or have negative perceptions about program evaluation, or when we hear the word evaluation. Perhaps that's due to personal experience. It could be due because we're close to the program, we're very proud of what we do, and when someone wants us to evaluate our program, we automatically think, we take it personally. Oh, what's wrong? So the intent of the UFE framework is to change that negative perception into a more positive perception of evaluation. These next 2 slides are just kind of indications of perceptions that people have about evaluation, and it's not personally attacking any stakeholder group. It's just kind of the nature of the beast, but thought that humor is always good to incorporate into our learning. So I'll let you just simply look at these slides yourself and see if that has any kind of influence on your perceptions about evaluation. Just a generic definition of evaluation, and this is again where sometimes the negative perceptions enter in, but to evaluate something means to determine its merit, its worth, its value, or its significance. And evaluations are usually done with some judgment in mind in the form of questions, and I think all of these questions are familiar to us. We often are wondering how effective the program is, what results were achieved, what is the fidelity of implementation, were the needs of the stakeholders met, were there any unanticipated consequences, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the program, how can the program be improved, what are the benefits of the program, and to what extent do those benefits outweigh the cost, and bottom line, many times, it's this question of should the program be maintained, increased, or decreased, especially in these tight fiscal times that all organizations and school districts are faced with. And here's another definition of evaluation. We kind of talked about the first bullet a little bit, but the second bullet, we talked about also that does it determine future action, and what other recommendations for future action does that entail? But evaluations overall really answer the 3 questions, the what, the so what, and the now what. And that's talked about on page 3 in your book, but that's in the simplest terms. Evaluations really do answer those 3 questions. So as you think about doing your own utilization-focused evaluation, one way to kind of make it more simple, especially in this beginning learning of your program evaluation, is to think about these 3 simple questions. What is it we're trying to evaluate? So if we evaluate this, so what? And then as a result of the so what, now what? What is the future actions that we want to take? Here are more specific questions that get to the what. So I'll let you look at those at your convenience. Here are the so what questions. Really, what do the findings mean and what judgments can be made? What kind of sense can we make of the findings? And once we've had a chance to analyze those findings, what recommendations flow from the findings and what improvements should be made? And should the funding continue? Should others adopt the program or avoid it? And they gave you the example on pages 6 and 7 in your book of the DARE case. So if you have an opportunity, you might want to determine the what, the so what, and the now what of DARE, which, as we all know, has been a controversial program utilized in many of our school districts nationwide and in Missouri as well. Here is the definition of utilization-focused evaluation. And again, this framework is the model that we are using to conduct a program evaluation. And so it's important to kind of know what the difference of UFE is compared to our program evaluations that we do traditionally in our school districts. And really, as a person who's had experience in public schools, just like you have, I do see differences because many of the evaluations that were conducted in my school district, of which I was asked to conduct several evaluations, I can't always say that the evaluation was used by intended users. And I think that's a distinct difference. Sometimes we conduct a program evaluation because we're asked to by our supervisor or by our Board of Education, or simply the public is demanding that we do that. So whatever stakeholder is involved. But the most important thing is that if we're going to spend the time doing program evaluations, we have to make sure we involve the intended users of those results. So UFE is highly personal, it's very situational. The evaluation facilitator, which all of you are going to play that role when you conduct your UFE project, you as an evaluation facilitator develops a working relationship with your intended users to help them determine what kind of evaluation they need. UFE isn't really advocating any particular content, model, method, theory, or even use. It has several steps involved, but the author points out that it really is a process so that the evaluation facilitator is working with the primary intended users to select what they believe is the most appropriate content, the model, the methods, the theory, and the uses for that particular evaluation. It's not the evaluation facilitator doing all of that. You're the facilitator, and you're helping guide your primary intended users through the process. So it's situational responsiveness and is an interactive process between you as the evaluator and your primary intended users so that you can focus on fitting the evaluation to your particular situation with special sensitivity to the context that surrounds you. And here is a more boiled down definition of UFE, kind of a summary of the previous slide. It's a process for making decisions about issues in collaboration with an identified group of primary users focusing on their intended uses of evaluation. And this framework, as you may have read about in Patton's book, is based on many, many years of research where they studied many, many different evaluation models. And that's how the framework was born, because Patton wanted to develop a framework that really focused on the intended uses of the results. And those evaluations he studied, where users were involved with focusing on the results, meant that those results were used much more than in evaluations where the primary intended users were not involved. UFE can include many different purposes. It can be evaluative in the form of formative or summative results. It can be quantitative or qualitative or a mixed design where lots of data is analyzed. The design can be naturalistic or experimental, and it can focus on any of those things that you see on the slide. It could even focus on processes, and not only on outcomes and impact, cost, and cost benefits, but also processes that take place in your school district. For example, professional development is a process, and that might be something that you would conduct a utilization-focused evaluation on. Maybe balanced literacy is a process, or PLC is a process. So it can be on a process, it can be on a program, but it's you and your primary intended users determining that focus. So let's get more specific with steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 of UFE. And as we talk about these steps, I'd like you to do a quick write. Write down an example of a program evaluation that you might want to do in your school district, and it might even be the one that you do for your UFE project. But just jot that down, and as we go through these steps, be thinking about that program evaluation. The most important thing about steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and really for that matter, all steps of the UFE process, is that it's an aligned process, and it's not necessarily linear. In other words, you might start with step 4 as your beginning step, rather than beginning with step 1. Or you might be working on steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 simultaneously as part of the evaluation process. Patton breaks it down into separate steps just so we get a better idea of what is involved with each step. But again, it's situational, and you as the evaluation facilitator, you need to determine where you begin on this continuum. But for purposes of our introduction to UFE, let's go ahead and start with steps 1 and 2. And so I've written down some page numbers that I think are helpful in your text to help us get a better idea of UFE. But steps 1 and 2 work very well together, and it's really up to the evaluation facilitator to determine that match between step 1 and step 2. So that match is the program and the organization ready for a utilization-focused evaluation, and you need to match that with the readiness of the evaluator and the competence of the evaluator to actually facilitate that utilization-focused evaluation. So it's assessing the match between the program and the evaluator, and that's very, very important, because if there's a mismatch, then the likelihood of the UFE results being used are much less. Let's look at step 1 on the left-hand side of your screen, and this is covering really pages 16 through 35 in your book. But the first thing that comes with assessing program and organizational readiness is getting to know the existing attitudes and behaviors about evaluation. We talked about those negative perceptions often associated with evaluation. So if you look at page 16 and 17, it's all of the different types of really attitudes that I know take place in all organizations. You've got your naysayers, you've got the compliant folks, you've got the cynics, the list goes on. You've got the sophisticates, you've got the political people. You as an evaluation facilitator need to begin with an assessment of existing attitudes and behaviors related to evaluation use. So pay attention to those different types of stakeholders and get to know their attitudes. And keep in mind that when you get ready to assemble your primary intended users team, you probably need a balance of all of these. But of course, I think we've mentioned that we're not going to have more than 5 primary intended users on when we get to the process of doing our UFE. Once you've done that, then it's important also to assess the evaluation context by reviewing documents and meeting with clients. And that's talked about on page 18. So the first step is often reviewing important documents that are associated with the program, and then meeting with key clients and interviewing some of those stakeholders, either individually or sometimes in a focus group. So you can learn more about the program's history, more about the political context, get a sense of the culture, and interact around why the evaluation is being conducted and how it is perceived. And we call this, kind of getting that commitment to people of reality testing. Because many of our program evaluations, we can't, they're oftentimes feel-good evaluations, but are we being true to ourselves and being honestly embracing the difficulties associated with a particular program? And that's why Patton calls this process testing reality with the stakeholders and various clients. There are a menu of exercises that you can use to facilitate stakeholder and readiness for UFE, and those are described on pages 20 and 21. So as you get ready to conduct your UFE process, these are some strategies that you might want to do to determine readiness for the evaluation. And just one that I think is very important, and just from my own personal experience, is on page 20, number 3. Create a positive vision for evaluation. So asking users the question, if evaluation was really useful and actually used, what would that look like? So getting a sense from your stakeholders, what would they like to see included in the evaluation process? Generating questions for evaluation, number 10, on the chart also. That's especially useful with groups that are expecting the evaluator to determine the evaluation questions. Well, you're not necessarily doing that. You're creating those questions with your users. So please take time to review the menu of exercises because you might be using those when you get ready to conduct your evaluation. But the whole idea is, step 1, is to assess readiness, and you're deepening the commitment to the evaluation process so that when the results happen, the results will actually get used. Let's move on to step 2, where this is where you're assessing your own competence as an evaluator. And there are 6 essential evaluator competencies on page 38 and 39 that you'll want to review. Most of us don't have, I would say, these essential competencies in place because our role is not simply to be evaluators. There are professional evaluators, and they probably possess the competence, and in many situations in school districts, they want evaluators to have these competencies because they like the credibility, of course. So review and self-assess yourself in terms of against these competencies and see where you stand. We're going to try to practice these competencies as we conduct our UFE evaluation as a part of the project. So just review those. Evaluator credibility is talked about on pages 40 and 41 of your book. They have conducted research that, of course, evaluator credibility is a central factor in the overall credibility of evaluation findings. So evaluation should be conducted by qualified people who establish and maintain credibility in the evaluation context. And that is something that the American Evaluation Association of Guiding Principles for Evaluators believe is a guiding principle. And so the guiding principle for evaluator competence is talked about on page 41. And so we need facilitation skills, we need professional training and competence, and the list goes on. So you might take time to review that. Page 50 talks about the evaluator needing not only the hard skills, which are the technical skills, the competence, the credibility, the know-how, the content knowledge of how to conduct an evaluation, but evaluators must also have soft skills. They must be able to have positive relationships with people. And so they have good people skills. And it's important to have both. And that's talked about on page 50. And if we go to page 43, there is Exhibit 2.2 that there is a diagram that talks about factors to increase the likelihood that an evaluation will actually be perceived as credible and therefore more likely to be used. And so this diagram says that if the evaluator is competent, if the evaluator is committed to use, if the evaluator has credibility, then the likelihood of evaluation use skyrockets. In other words, the use and the findings of those evaluations will be used by your stakeholders. If credibility is missing, if the evaluator is not really committed to the use, or if the evaluator is not competent, then the use factor goes way down. And that's when evaluations sit on a shelf or are not being used. So the evaluator really has the total package. Has a good relationship between the evaluator and the primary intended users, and the evaluator helps negotiate evaluation with its primary intended users. And that requires facilitation skills. So you as an evaluation facilitator are not making all of the decisions. It's a negotiated process between you and the primary intended users. And that brings us to the adaptive cycle on pages 48 through 50, where as we get more experience with conducting evaluations, the easier this adaptive cycle is for us as evaluation facilitators. So we as facilitators need to have the ability to act, to react, to interact, and to adapt to any surprises that come our way. And here is an example of that cycle. So again, steps 1 and 2 of UFE is assessing the match between the program and the evaluator. And when that match is there, that's a really good step for undertaking a utilization-focused evaluation. And this is just a diagram that talks about how, on page 55, this evaluator, facilitator, really needs to be reflective and reflexive with triangulated inquiry, where you see on the left side you have to be very in tune with those individuals providing data for the evaluation, the staff and the participants. But you also have to be in tune to those receiving the evaluation, which are your users. And then you also have to be in tune with yourself as an evaluator and be reflective on when things didn't go so well and being able to own up to those things that did not go well as focusing on the things that do go well. So it's totally a triangulated inquiry process. And here is the match again. Save the last word is an activity that we were going to do to help us process the information, but we didn't have time to do that in class due to the weather, so we're going to skip over these slides. This is a protocol that you might want to use. The directions are all spelled out if you conduct staff development or work with your faculty. So we'll move on to step 3, which is identifying, organizing, and engaging primary intended users. So if we go to pages 61 through 66, The author spends a long time, many pages, talking about the personal factor based on many years of research. They found out that the personal factor is the presence of an identifiable individual or group of people who personally care about the evaluation and the findings it generates. And the research shows that the personal factor is the most important factor in an evaluation. In other words, you want to get the right people on the bus as far as primary intended users, because they personally care about the evaluation and the findings it generates. So people who are interested, they're enthusiastic, they're determined, they're committed, they're assertive, they're caring, and they care about what happens with the evaluation when the evaluation is finished. And these are the primary users of the evaluation. And the rest of those pages talks about the importance of the personal factor. Again, with much research done on the personal factor. There is a definition more specific in the box at the top of page 65 that helps us understand that. And at the bottom of that box it says, nothing makes a larger difference in the use of evaluations than the personal factor. The interest of people in learning from the evaluation. Pages 66 through 69 talks about identifying and working with the primary intended users, and once they've been identified. And again, I think we've said this before, but the purpose of the evaluation must be determined. Criteria has to be developed for judging a program's success. Methods have to be selected, timelines agreed upon. All of these are important issues in any evaluation. So the question is, who will decide those issues? Well, the answer in utilization-focused evaluation is your primary intended users of the evaluation. It's not you as the evaluator or facilitator making those decisions. You're doing it together with the people who have the vested interest in the evaluation. So on page 67 in the blue box, it again defines primary intended users. And they're specific stakeholders selected to work with the evaluator throughout the evaluation to focus the evaluation, participate in design, methods decisions, interpreting the results, so that the findings are useful, meaningful, relevant, and credible. And they represent key and diverse stakeholder groups who have responsibility for transmitting those evaluation findings to those who need to use the findings as well. Sometimes, to help our primary intended users get a better idea of what does an effective program evaluation look like, we have to provide them with exemplars, just like we do with our students and sometimes in professional development with our staffs. So exemplars are talked about on page 69 and 70. And so we know that oftentimes our primary intended users, that's not their job. They're not used to conducting evaluations. So we have to provide them with some examples so they get a better idea of what that might look like. Page 79 includes some important tips for selecting and working with primary intended users. So we've talked about finding and involving the right people who are interested, and also people who have influence. And so we want those tipping point connectors. We want those who can facilitate high quality interactions with primary intended users. We really want to develop their facilitation skills. Once we select those people, we need to train them. They need to be individuals that demonstrate cultural competence and sensitivity. And we need to work with a manageable number of primary intended users. So as you're thinking about your primary intended users for your project, please pay attention to those tips. And on, let's see, page 73, as you're thinking about your PIUs, look at the power versus interest grid. And we'll discuss that just here in a moment on the slide. But you have what's called low power stakeholders and high power stakeholders. And you really need both on your team. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. And don't get caught in the deadly sins of evaluation to take away from your evaluation being user-focused. And one of those deadly sins is talked about on page 83, where you're the primary decision maker. That's listed as number 1. That's a trap that often happens with the evaluation process done across organizations and in schools, is that you as the evaluator, I'm guilty of it myself. I have an idea of what I think I want that evaluation to look like, right? And so I make all of the decisions in the design, the methodology, and interpreting the results. I make those decisions. So there are 10 deadly sins that you want to be sure to review. And one of them including identifying your users and then not involving them. So I can relate to that. I've been on committees where I've been asked to be on a committee, and all of a sudden I'm not involved anymore. And that's usually because of time or whatever the case might be. So with UFE, we want to stay away from the deadly sins. Here's our power versus interest grid. And you see on the left-hand side, your high interest stakeholders, your low interest stakeholders. But at the top, you see your low power stakeholders and high power stakeholders. So really, again, let's just review this. Right underneath low power stakeholders, you've got support and enhance their capacity to be involved. Their involvement increases the diversity of the evaluation. So they have low power, but you really do need to involve them so that they can be involved. And that helps with the diversity in the evaluation, as opposed to the high power stakeholder, where they're often the key players who have the power, right, to affect use. You need those people as well. Last night we talked about high power stakeholders being possibly board members, low power stakeholders possibly being parents, which gets into low interest stakeholders and low power stakeholders. We want to involve those low power, low interest stakeholders, inform them about the evaluation and its findings so that we don't have a crowd of people that actually sabotage or mob the evaluation, as opposed to the low interest stakeholder and the high power stakeholder. They may not be interested, but we know they have a lot of power. And so it's important to involve those people as well. So as you think about your primary intended users, think about the power versus interest grid. And that takes us to situation analysis, and this will be the last step that we talk about tonight. And the most important thing about this step is when you're doing a UFE evaluation, you are conducting situation analysis throughout the whole process, where you as the evaluation facilitator are continually evaluating how the evaluation is going. And the examples that we have for you with that is number 1, when you're assessing building, program, and organizational readiness, what you're doing in step 1 is you're analyzing the program situation. With step 2, when you're assessing evaluator readiness and competence, you're analyzing the evaluator situation. And the same thing with step 3. When we're identifying our primary intended users, we're analyzing the stakeholder situation. So that's simply what situation analysis is. So it doesn't only happen in step 4. It happens throughout all steps of the UFE process. Step 4 calls for it to be a focused process, intentional and systematic situation analysis with PIUs. And it's ongoing throughout all steps. And we talked about that, and it's talked about on page 88. How to begin situation analysis is talked about on page 89. There are some really good questions to help us analyze the situation with understanding the program. You see about 6 questions there. Identifying primary stakeholders and their interest. There are good questions to ask. Getting a history with the evaluation of program. There are some questions to ask. And decision and action context. The author gives us 3 questions. So again, these are good questions to help us get started with thinking about situation analysis and how to begin that process. Another good way is force field analysis. And I'm moving on to this next screen. This is a tool, kind of a graphic organizers, that many of my students have used when they were doing their situation analysis with their UFE process. They identified a topic and they asked themselves a question: what are the positive forces for evaluating this topic? And what are the negative forces if we evaluate this particular topic? So you might want to think using that as a tool in your UFE evaluation. And this template is under week 1 folder for you to use should you decide to use that in your UFE project. Okay, so if we go back to situational factors, pages 93 and 94, these particular factors could actually affect a user's participation and then the findings and the use of results. So you want to pay attention to those factors, and I believe there are 20 of them. Things such as the program's prior evaluation experience. It might be the first time ever the program's been evaluated, or seemingly endless evaluations have been done. So it kind of gets to both extremes of this continuum. Maybe a factor is the purpose of the evaluation, which is on number 2 on page 93. The purpose on the left side says, well, maybe this evaluation is more formative. The right-hand side, or the other extreme, maybe it's a funding decision, so it's a more summative. So staff and participants' education levels, that could also be a factor. The extreme is this is a highly educated group with primary intended users or a low educated group. So pay attention to those factors that can affect the participation and the use of the evaluation. So the question is, how can evaluators prepare themselves to deal with a variety of situations? So that particular graphic organizer helps us deal with those situations. As we all know from our experiences with evaluations, evaluators can be internal, can be conducted, facilitated by people within the school district, internal stakeholders, or it could be facilitated by an external evaluator that comes in from the outside. And the answer as to whether or not you should use a program when it's being evaluated, should use an internal or an external evaluator, there really is no right answer to that because it depends on the context of the program and the situation. Again, that's part of your situation analysis. Should we use an internal evaluator to do this program, or should we use an external? So, and I think you can think of the advantages and the disadvantages. That could happen with both, which are talked about pages 96 through 102. An internal evaluator might be too close to a situation. So it may not be good to have an internal evaluator if there's a lot of negativity toward the program. It might be better to have an external evaluator. At the same time, The internal evaluator has good relationships with folks that an external evaluator doesn't have. So that's something that is taken into consideration as part of situation analysis. Pages 102 through 106 talks about evaluation as a leadership function. And I think in all of our organizations today and in our school district, if you're a leader, evaluation is just part of the job. And so how can we infuse evaluation to be a leadership function throughout the organization, that it be a responsibility of all leaders within the evaluation? So the author calls that results-oriented evaluation. And certainly in the school district that I spent practically 30 years in, evaluation was considered a leadership function. We were all responsible for evaluating our program, not in a summative way, but a continuous improvement and ongoing way, so that we could focus continually on results and adjust to any changes that we would need based on evaluation results. So many of our evaluations that we do in our school districts are more formative in nature, because it's just a part of what we do as leaders. So pay attention also to the last part of this slide, which is on risk assessment and contingency thinking. When you meet with your primary intended users, you want to ask them those questions on page 106 so that you do a front-end risk assessment and just ask them, what are the possible things that could go wrong in this evaluation? If we do this, what could possibly go wrong as part of this process? And number two, what's the likelihood that it could go wrong? And number three, if it did go wrong, what are the consequences and how bad would it be if things went downhill or went badly? So again, it helps build that relationship when you ask those contingency types of questions and risk assessment, because it makes them feel involved, that you really do care about what they think. So it really is a proactive way to tackle the evaluation process, but it's also another way to get your primary intended users to really think about reality testing in such an evaluation process. All right, so those are the 4 steps that we talked about last night. And here we are, force field analysis again. And all of these steps, in terms of situation analysis, this diagram shows how each of the steps are step number 4, because, again, steps 1 and 2 are situation analysis. Step 3 is situation analysis. And, so step 4 isn't by itself. So this is just a complex diagram that shows the interaction of steps 1 through 4. And this is the last word protocol, again, that we didn't use last night. So tonight, we reviewed the expectations for the Education 760 class. I hope you have a better idea of defining the role and purpose of particularly UFE evaluation. We didn't really get into the UFE checklist, but I'll introduce that in week 2. But we did learn steps 1 through 4 of the UFE framework, and we tried to think about steps 1 through 4 in the program evaluation ideas that we wrote down as a quick write, but we didn't actually have direct experience with applying those steps. But we tried to talk about how you would incorporate those steps into a program evaluation that you might do. So we'll get more experience with applying steps 1 through 4 in week 2 and subsequent weeks as we get closer to doing our UFE projects. So here are assignments for next week. We'll learn about steps 5, 6, and 7, so we'll need to make sure that we're prepared by reading pages 113 through 190 of Patton's book. Your journal article review 1 is due by Ross designing and using program evaluation as a tool for reform. And I did send everyone an email in terms of what we were thinking specifically about that journal article review. So please make sure you follow those directions so you can follow the assessment procedure when your review article is scored. And then next week, be thinking, please come to class and kind of think about the UFE evaluation that you will conduct as your project. And I'll ask you to share your thinking about that next week. And so I hope you have enjoyed this review. Oh, and here's the diagram. We'll talk more, we'll revisit this diagram with outlining each week's responsibilities and what we'll be learning. But I just had that again at the end of the slide for your use. And thank you. And I hope this has been helpful, that serves as a review for you if you were in class or if you missed class. So thank you very much and have a great week.